Hello and welcome to your next week's worth of lessons. So, we are going to retrieve socialism today. An incredibly important concept is the whole of an inspector. So, what socialist ideas has Priestley presented us with through the inspector? So, think back through the play and what examples of the inspector representing Priestley's socialist views have we seen? We're also going to retrieve collectivist from last lesson. So why do you think Priestley shows both Sheila and Eric to have collectivist attitudes? Okay, so think about what a collectivist is. Why would Priestley have Sheila and Eric, despite their upper middle class upbringing, having collectivist attitudes? And then our new word for today is microcosm. So a microcosm is a small place, society or situation that has the same characteristics as something much larger. So if something is a microcosm, then that little area or that situation that is happening in a book or film or TV show represents something wider or larger. It's a little bit like symbolism, something representing something else. But this is about a place or a society or a situation itself representing something more than itself. So think about what the events in the Burlings house are a microcosm of. So think about the Burlings' attitudes, their treatment of Eva Smith. What is that a microcosm of in wider society? Okay, so you can pause the video now, answer those questions. So what socialist ideas does Priestley present us with through the inspector? Now remember, the inspector's character is simply J.B. Priestley's mouthpiece on stage. The inspector exists to be able to convey Priestley's views to the Burling family and therefore to the audience. So what we see from the inspector is that he doesn't believe in the class system. He doesn't believe that the Burlings deserve any more respect than he would treat any other human being. He is not intimidated by Mr. or Mrs. Burling or Gerald's status. He shows immense sympathy and empathy and understanding with Eva Smith. He shows this idea of it's really important for people and the Burling family to accept their responsibility and accept their guilt and change and realise that they have a duty to the vulnerable members of society like Eva Smith, and they should use their privilege for good. Now, there's a lot of talk, rightly so, the last week or so about privilege, particularly used in the context of white privilege, with what's going on in America at the moment and the murder of George Floyd and the protests that are popping up all over the world. This concept of privilege and people using their white privilege to battle against the injustice of what happened to not only George Floyd and others is a really interesting way of viewing this idea of privilege. You know, having privilege doesn't make you a bad person. Often privilege is simply due to your birth, the family you're born into, the place in the world you're born into. Having privilege doesn't make you a bad person, and Priestley's not saying that. But what the Burling family have is financial privilege, and they should use that financial privilege and power to help the less fortunate than themselves, like Eva Smith. But in fact, they treated her in the complete opposite. They systematically, between them, destroyed this girl's life, which is, of course, the message, the socialist message that Priestley is trying to convey. So a collectivist is when you view yourself as members of one body or one society. You're not worried about your personal individual self. You're worried about the collective good of everybody. So Priestley shows both Sheila and Eric to have more open-minded collectivist attitudes because they are members of the younger generation, remember, and Priestley is showing here that the younger generation are far more open to social change and reform than the older generation. And actually Priestley is aiming this play at the younger generation in the audience. He knows that it's very unlikely you're going to change the older generation. They're too stuck in their ways. So instead, he focuses on the much more impressionable younger generation in the audience. So both Sheila and Eric are those models to those audience members that are, of a similar generation to their characters, and they are supposed to be inspired to change like those two characters. So the Burling family's house is a microcosm of wider society. So everything that the Burling families believe, everything that they did to Eva Smith and Eva Smith's eventual suicide is all a microcosm of these wider issues happening in society. So that, what happened to Eva Smith is symbolic of what is happening to millions of poor men and women and children, not only in the country but in the world. So that's what we mean by a microcosm. Okay, what's happening in the Burling family's dining room in this play is representative of the wider ills of society, and particularly for the poor. So today we're going to analyse how Priestley uses language to present socialist ideas in his final speech, so in the inspector's final speech. Okay, so we're only going to be looking at a really short bit of the play today. So by the end of the lesson, you will know how Priestley uses language to present his socialist views through the inspector's final speech, and how the inspector's final speech links to Priestley's beliefs and intentions in writing the novel. So the inspector's about to leave, and before he leaves, he makes a final speech to the Burling family, which is a really fantastic summing up, really, of everything that Priestley wants the Burling family and, of course, us to learn. Okay, so we are going to have a listen to this speech, and you will see in the email that you received from me or your class teacher that there is a copy of the speech as well, just for your sort of reference for the next task. Okay, I just realised I didn't share the audio. Bear with me. There we go.
Listen to me. This girl died a horrible death, but each of you helped to kill her. And don't ever forget that. But then I don't think you ever will. Remember, Mrs. Burling, you turned her away when she most needed help. You refused her even the pitiable little bit of organized charity you had in your power to grant her. Eric, remember what you did?
My God, I'm not likely to forget.
You used her for the end of a stupid, drunken evening. As if she was an animal. A thing, not a person. You, Miss Burling.
I had her turned out of a job. I started it.
You helped. And didn't start it. Mr. Burling. You started it. She wanted 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and sixpence. You made her pay a heavy price for that. And now she'll make you pay a heavier price still.
So this bit's really important, because what we have here is the inspector summing up what each of the characters did. And notice it's only Sheila and Eric who have anything to say for themselves. Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling are quiet. Now this line's really significant that the inspector's just said, she'll make you pay a heavy price. What he means, or at least what we can interpret at this point in the play, is what he means is that they've got to live with the guilt of what they've done, and part of that change that he wants to see from these characters is the acceptance of their guilt, the acceptance that they treated her wrongly and they are all collectively responsible for her suicide. So that this idea of collective responsibility is what Priestley's wanting to convey here.
Inspector, I'd give thousands. Thousands.
You're offering the money at the wrong time.
So that's a really ironic bit as well. Mr. Burling saying, look, I'd give thousands. Yes, thousands. So now he's worried about a public scandal. He's prepared to give money to make the situation go away. But what he wasn't prepared to do is take a tiny little cut to his profits to pay Eva Smith and his workers a fair wage. So we see the hypocrisy and the irony in this statement that Mr. Burling is only prepared to give money when it's going to benefit him. He's not interested in actually benefiting the less fortunate, which is what Priestley wants him to learn.
No, I don't think any of you will forget. Nor that young man Croft, though he at least had some affection for her and made her happy for a time. Well, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm, and you can't do her any good either. You can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith.
That's the worst of it.
Well, remember this. One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives.
So that's a really, this is the beginning of his speech, really. So he's saying there's millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. So no, you can't help Eva Smith. She's dead. There's nothing you can do for her. But what you can do is go out and help the millions of men and women just like her in this country. Their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their chance of happiness is all intertwined with the lives of people like the Burlings. He's saying you have a moral responsibility to use your wealth and your power and your privilege for good. Just like there are currently many white people on these marches, as I mentioned at the start of the lesson, feeling like they should have the moral obligation to use their privilege as a white person to try and shed light on the injustice that is happening, to the African Americans in America and to people of color and different races, all over the world. So it's this idea of privilege. But what Priestley is saying is to the Burlings, use your privilege and your power and your wealth to learn from this and to help all of the men and women that are like Eva Smith. Because you could massively transform and change these people's lives for the better.
With what we think and say and do, we don't live alone. We're members of one body, responsible for each other.
So this is, again, very socialist ideals. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for one another. So what he's saying that this socialist ideology and views, we are not individualists. This every man for himself attitude is not going to make a successful and fair and happy society. We're all part of the human race. We are all in this together and we all have to look after one another. This is what he's saying to the Burling family.
And I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night.
So that final line just before he leaves is really important as well. He says, if men will not learn that lesson, so this socialist lesson that he's trying to teach, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Now, anguish means incredible distress and sorrow. Now, remember, this play was written in the final year of World War II in 1945, but set in 1912 before both world wars. Now, if we were in the classroom right now, we'd be having an incredibly interesting discussion, I'm sure, about what he could be referring to there. Now, obviously, there's the dramatic irony here that the audience members would know that in 2 years' time, World War I is going to start. And then following that, World War II. And they will know that both those wars, as horrific and horrendous and destructive as they were, did a lot to further the causes of socialism, of social justice and equality. So what Priestley's saying here is if people will not learn this lesson the right way, then they will be taught it through suffering. and through sorrow. So that's a very emotive and powerful message when you're an audience in 1946, having experienced at the very least World War II, if not World War I as well. And what Priestley is in many ways implying here is that it's almost God's punishment. You know, World War I and II was some sort of divine punishment because mankind wouldn't learn the right lessons about how to treat each other. So they had to be taught it through this incredible suffering. Fire as well has connotations of hell. And, you know, Priestley was a Christian, so it is likely that, you know, that was his intention there, to get this, again, this idea of suffering and torment. Of course, you know, if you're a Christian, hell is the place you go if you are an unrepentant sinner. So this idea of being, you know, mankind being punished if they do not learn these socialist lessons is an incredibly powerful message for Priestley to leave us with before the inspector leaves. And remember, the inspector, of course, is J.B. Priestley's mouthpiece on stage. So I'm just going to get the PowerPoint back up for us, and we'll see the written task that we're going to do. So, why is Mr. Burling offering thousands of pounds now significant? How does the way the inspector speaks to the different characters reveal the way he views them? So think about the different way he speaks to Mrs. Burling, maybe in Mr. Burling compared to Eric and Sheila. And what final message does the inspector leave them with? So think about the fire and blood and anguish. So you can pause the video and answer those questions. So, and then I'd like you to answer this question, please. How does Priestley present his socialist views in the inspector's final speech? So you could either write an explanation of how Priestley is expressing his socialist views in the inspector's final speech, or pick a quotation and write a mini PE paragraph analysing how your quotation presents Priestley's socialist beliefs. So either just write a brief explanation about what socialist message Priestley is saying in the inspector's speech, or you can pick a quotation and write a mini PE paragraph instead. So you can pause the video and get that done. If you would like a model or to compare something you've written, here is a model mini PE. When the inspector says that each of the Burling family helped to kill Eva Smith, the verb suggests the socialist view of collective responsibility because each of their mistreatment of her character led to her death, and therefore they have collective responsibility. Priestley realises his intention successfully here because despite the horror of what the Burling family has done, he is saying that they can find relief through the socialist idea of responsibility and by collectively sharing their guilt. So that's just an example, a model of a mini PE, if that's what you're choosing to write. So finally then, why do you think Priestley uses the Burling family as a microcosm of society? So how does, you know, his use of this technique link to his intentions? And what do you think is Priestley's most effective example of his socialist beliefs in the inspector's speech? So what's the most effective use of language in that final speech to convey his socialist beliefs? Okay. That's it for today, and I will see you tomorrow.